The Napoleonic Wars, the making of a continental power, 1796 to 1804, Part 1. The coronation that shocked Europe. On the morning of December 2nd, 1804, the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris was transformed into a stage upon which the fate of Europe seemed to hang. Nobles, diplomats, generals, and clergy filled the vast Gothic interior. The air was thick with incense and anticipation. At the center of the ceremony stood Pope Pius VII, invited from Rome to sanctify what was meant to be a traditional coronation. But what happened next unsettled every monarch in Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, once a minor Corsican artillery officer, approached the altar. Instead of kneeling to receive the crown from the Pope, he lifted it himself. Slowly, deliberately, he placed it upon his own head. It was not a spontaneous gesture. It was calculated. In that single act, he announced to Europe that his authority came neither from divine right nor ancient lineage, but from power, earned, seized, constructed. Yet this moment was not the beginning of his rise. It was its declaration. To understand how Europe arrived at this cathedral, how revolution gave birth to empire, we must return to a continent trembling in fear. Which raises an extraordinary question. How does a young artillery officer from a remote Mediterranean island, with no royal blood, no ancient title, and barely even the approval of his own countrymen, rise high enough to crown himself Emperor of France? To answer that, we must go back to the very beginning. Not to Paris, not to a palace, but to a rugged island in the Mediterranean Sea in 1769, a boy named Napoleon Bonaparte was born. Just a year before his birth, Corsica had been conquered by France, which meant that Napoleon technically grew up French, but culturally, things were a little more complicated. At home, his family spoke Italian dialects. Corsican traditions shaped his upbringing, and politically, many people on the island still resented French rule. In other words, Napoleon grew up feeling slightly like an outsider everywhere he went. His family was not poor, but they were far from powerful. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a minor lawyer who managed to secure a small noble status under the French administration. That title wasn't impressive in Paris, but it was just enough to open one very important door. It allowed young Napoleon to attend French military school. At the age of 9, Napoleon was sent to mainland France to study, and this was not exactly a pleasant experience. He spoke French with a thick Corsican accent. His classmates came from wealthy aristocratic families. And Napoleon, short, serious, and socially awkward, did not fit in particularly well. Many students mocked him. Napoleon responded the only way he knew how, by ignoring them completely and burying himself in books. He devoured works on mathematics, history, and military strategy. He became especially fascinated with the great commanders of the past, figures like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. And slowly, something became clear. Napoleon was very, very good at artillery mathematics, which, admittedly, does not sound very glamorous. But in the 18th century, artillery was the most technical branch of the military. It required precise calculations, angles, distances, trajectories. Cannons were not simply fired at the enemy and hoped for the best. Someone had to figure out exactly where those cannonballs would land. Napoleon excelled at this. By the age of 16, he graduated from military academy and became a lieutenant in the French artillery. At this point, nothing about his career looked extraordinary. He was just another young officer in the massive French army. No famous battles, no dramatic victories, no signs that he would one day become one of the most powerful men in Europe. And, under normal circumstances, he probably wouldn't have, because in pre-revolutionary France, the military hierarchy was dominated by aristocrats. High-ranking positions were controlled by noble families who had held power for generations. Advancement was slow and heavily influenced by social status. A man without the right connections could spend his entire career waiting for promotion. Napoleon knew this very well. But then history decided to dramatically change the rules. In 1789, the French Revolution at Beaune erupted. At first, it was a political crisis, but very quickly it turned into something far more chaotic. The monarchy was challenged, aristocratic privileges were abolished, and France began to tear apart the old system that had governed it for centuries. For the French military, the revolution had an unexpected side effect. Many aristocratic officers fled the country, thousands of them. Some feared the radical revolutionaries, others openly opposed the new government. Either way, they abandoned their positions and escaped to neighboring monarchies like Austria and Prussia. Suddenly, the French army had a massive problem. There were not enough commanders. Entire levels of the officer corps had vanished almost overnight. And when a system collapses like that, opportunity appears, especially for ambitious young officers who are ready to take it. Napoleon was exactly that kind of officer. His first real chance arrived in 1793 during the siege of Toulon. Toulon was one of the most important naval ports in France, located along the Mediterranean coast. But during the revolution, royalist rebels inside the city revolted against the revolutionary government and invited British and Spanish forces to occupy the port, which meant that a major French naval base was suddenly controlled by the enemies of France. This was not ideal. The revolutionary government sent an army to retake the city, but the siege dragged on with little progress. Commanders argued. Plans failed. Morale dropped. Then a young artillery officer proposed a different strategy. Instead of attacking the city walls directly, Napoleon argued that French forces should capture several strategic hills overlooking the harbor. If artillery could be positioned there, the cannons would dominate the entire port and make it impossible for the British fleet to stay. It was a risky plan, but the French commanders approved it. Napoleon personally organized the artillery batteries and directed the bombardment. When the guns finally opened fire from those elevated positions, the results were devastating. British ships in the harbor suddenly found themselves under constant cannon fire. Remaining in Toulon was no longer safe. The British withdrew their fleet and evacuated the city. Toulon fell. Napoleon was 24 years old, and suddenly, people in Paris started paying attention. He was promoted to brigadier general shortly afterward, an extraordinary rise for someone so young. But the revolution was not finished, creating opportunities for him. 2 years later, another crisis erupted in Paris. Royalist supporters attempted to overthrow the revolutionary government. Thousands of armed men marched through the streets toward the government buildings. The leaders of the revolution panicked. They needed someone to stop the uprising immediately. They chose Napoleon. His solution was extremely straightforward. Napoleon positioned artillery directly in the streets and waited for the royalist crowd to approach. Then he ordered his cannons to fire grape shot. For anyone unfamiliar with grape shot, imagine turning a cannon into a giant shotgun. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The royalist attack collapsed within minutes. The government survived. And Napoleon gained a reputation as a man who could end a crisis quickly, sometimes very quickly. From that moment on, he was no longer just another officer. He was a rising political and military figure. Within a year, he would be given command of an entire French army. And within a decade, he would crown himself Emperor of France, which, if you think about it, is quite an impressive career progression for someone who started out as the quiet kid with the weird accent at military school. But the true legend of Napoleon, the campaigns, the battles, the rise of an empire, was only just beginning. And Europe was about to learn his name the hard way. Europe, after revolution, a vacuum of power. The French Revolution did not merely topple a king, it destabilized the very foundations of European politics. When Louis XVI was executed in 1793, monarchies across Europe understood the event not as a French crisis, but as an ideological contagion. Austria feared it. Prussia feared it. Britain financed coalitions to contain it. France, meanwhile, was exhausted. Years of internal purges, political extremism, and economic collapse had left the country unstable. The reign of terror had ended, but stability had not returned. The Directory, the five-man executive government established in 1795, struggled to maintain legitimacy. Corruption was widespread. Inflation ravaged the economy. The army, though large, was poorly supplied. Yet the army was also France's only real strength. And it was within that army that Napoleon Bonaparte found his opportunity. The Italian campaign, war as theater and strategy. In 1796, Napoleon was given command of the Army of Italy, a posting that many considered secondary. The primary focus remained along the Rhine against Austria. The Italian front was underfunded and underappreciated. Napoleon saw something others did not. Rather than treating Italy as a distraction, he recognized that Austrian forces there were divided and poorly coordinated. If struck quickly and decisively, they could be defeated in sequence before reinforcements arrived. His army was hungry and unpaid. He addressed them not with technical briefings, but with promises. He spoke of glory, wealth, fertile plains beyond the mountains. He understood morale as a weapon. What followed was not merely a series of victories, it was a redefinition of operational warfare. At battles such as Montenotte and Dago, Napoleon maneuvered rapidly, exploiting interior lines to strike isolated enemy columns. Instead of engaging a unified Austrian army, he dismantled it piece by piece. Speed replaced caution. Concentration replaced rigidity. The Battle of Lodi became symbolic. Facing Austrian artillery across a narrow bridge, Napoleon ordered a frontal assault that appeared reckless. French soldiers hesitated under cannon fire. Then, in a dramatic moment that would later fuel his legend, Napoleon advanced toward the bridge himself. Whether this was genuine bravery or strategic theater is debated. What is not debated is its effect. The army followed. Victory at Lodi convinced Napoleon of something profound, that he was capable of extraordinary destiny. He later suggested that it was at Lodi he first sensed he was a superior being. That psychological transformation may have mattered as much as the battlefield success. Controlling the narrative, Napoleon understood something rare among generals. Military victory alone was insufficient. Perception mattered. He issued bulletins to Paris, exaggerating achievements and minimizing setbacks. His campaigns were framed not as risky maneuvers, but as inevitable triumphs. Newspapers repeated his language. Illustrations portrayed him as heroic, composed, almost mythic. By the time Austria sued for peace in 1797, with the Treaty of Campo Formio, Napoleon was not simply a general, he was a political phenomenon. This made the Directory uneasy. A successful general can defend a republic. A popular general can overthrow one. Egypt. Ambition. Beyond Europe. Britain remained France's most persistent enemy. Direct invasion across the English Channel was risky and dependent on naval superiority France did not possess. Napoleon proposed an alternative: strike at Britain's economic lifeline by invading Egypt and threatening its trade routes to India. The plan was bold and strategically imaginative. It also conveniently removed Napoleon from Paris, where his influence was growing. In 1798, French forces landed in Egypt. The victory at the Battle of the Pyramids showcased Napoleon's tactical innovation. Disciplined infantry squares repelled cavalry charges effectively. Yet the success was short-lived. Admiral Horatio Nelson located the French fleet anchored at Aboukir Bay. In the Battle of the Nile, British ships destroyed or captured most of the French fleet. The French army was stranded. Napoleon pressed forward into Syria, but the siege of Acre failed. Disease spread through the ranks. Supply lines stretched thin. The campaign stalled. Facing mounting difficulty, Napoleon made a controversial decision. He left Egypt in 1799, returning to France while his army remained behind. Critics viewed it as abandonment. Supporters saw it as political instinct. In truth, France once again stood on the brink of instability, and Napoleon sensed opportunity. The coup of 18 Brumaire. By late 1799, the Directory's authority was eroding. War fatigue and economic distress fueled dissatisfaction. Political factions maneuvered against one another. Napoleon aligned himself with influential figures who sought governmental restructuring. On November 9, 1799, 18 Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, he participated in a carefully planned coup. The execution, however, was far from smooth. When Napoleon addressed the Council of 500, accusations of dictatorship erupted. The atmosphere grew chaotic. For a brief moment, the coup seemed on the verge of collapse. It was military intervention that resolved it. Soldiers cleared the chamber. The Directory was dissolved. The consulate replaced it. Napoleon became first consul. Though France remained nominally a republic, power now concentrated overwhelmingly in his hands. Reform and consolidation. Unlike many revolutionaries, Napoleon understood that stability required structure. He introduced sweeping administrative reforms. The Napoleonic Code unified French civil law, emphasizing equality before the law and secular authority. The tax system was reorganized. The Bank of France stabilized currency. Educational institutions were restructured to produce loyal civil servants and officers. He reconciled with the Catholic Church through the Concordat of 1801, restoring religious practice while maintaining state control. Externally, temporary peace was achieved with Austria and Britain. But beneath this calm lay ambition. In 1802, Napoleon became first consul for life. The Republic, in spirit, was fading. Emperor of the French. By 1804, concerns over assassination plots and political stability provided justification for further consolidation of power. The Senate proclaimed the establishment of an empire. Napoleon accepted. The coronation ceremony was designed to communicate permanence and legitimacy, yet also independence. By crowning himself, Napoleon symbolically severed reliance on traditional monarchical or ecclesiastical authority. He was not King of France in the old sense. He was Emperor of the French, a title rooted in nation rather than dynasty. Europe reacted with alarm. Britain refused reconciliation. Austria and Russia prepared for renewed conflict. The Third Coalition began to form. Napoleon had reshaped France. Now he would attempt to reshape Europe. And in 1805, on fields near a town called Austerlitz, he would test whether his empire was durable or merely dramatic.